Welcome to the Victress Podcast, where we help women and families achieve their best health, body, and soul. Here are your hosts, Lisa Marino and Aaron Hazelbaker.
Hello, and welcome back to the Victress Podcast. We have a very important topic today, and that is mental health. And I'm excited to be able to bring on our first special guest, which is a school psychologist, a very close friend of mine, Jenkins. But before we do that, I just want to start in prayer because there's obviously so much pain, so much suffering that surrounds this topic of mental health. And it comes very near and dear to my heart, and I'm sure to many of you as well. So let's put ourselves in that mind of prayer and just bring to mind ourselves or anyone that we know in our families, friends, our communities that have been suffering due to mental health, especially for those that don't have anyone to pray for them. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. God, lover of souls, you hold dear what you have made, and spare all things, for they are yours. Look gently on your servants, and by the blood of the cross, forgive our sins and failings. Remember the faith of those who mourn, and satisfy their longing for that day when all will be made new again in Christ, our Lord, risen Lord, who lives and reigns with you forever and ever. Amen. And with the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Again, before we bring Jason on, I just want to point you to some resources. There will be in the show notes lots of practical tips, not only what we will discuss in the podcast, but what you need to know as parents and some resources to be able to reach out if you do need any assistance as far as mental health, finding treatment, or seeking help. Additionally, myself and Elizabeth Barhorse will be speaking at Home and Interiors next Wednesday, September 25th at 6:30, and we'll be talking about brain health and mental health and the nutritional and the spiritual and the physical implications of that, things that you can do to prevent and to help heal not only yourselves but your family. Again, we're focused on the practical things. What can we be doing for our families and for ourselves? We really just want to be hitting the high points of mental health as parents, as families. What does that look like? What do we need to be looking out for? How do we prevent, things like anxiety and depression? So just give you a little bit of background before I bring Jason on. Jason actually grew up in Goldsboro, North Carolina, and he was raised in the Baptist church. So he's got an interesting perspective going through RCIA back in 2008 and taking his good old time to join the church. He made sure he was confident with that decision. He joined the Catholic Church in 2015. So that's another podcast for another time, but certainly gives him a judgment-free, pass. But he has a Bachelor's of Arts in Psychology from East Carolina University, a Master's of Arts with School Psychology specialty from Western Carolina University, and he is a school psychologist overseeing approximately 12 to 1,300 students here in Ohio. So welcome, Jason.
Thank you.
So we really want to go over, what are the practical tips? What are we missing as, parents? What can we do to set ourselves up, for success, to prevent anxiety, or what do we need to be looking out for? And this really comes, at a really important time. And just looking at Ohio alone, where we're at, suicide rates have increased 24% just in the last 10 years. That's pretty striking. And then really hitting close to home, Aaron and I grew up in Dayton, and we just, had a mass shooting only 2-3 weeks ago. There was another tragic car accident. We knew, one of the family members involved. So a lot of these, tragedies are hitting close to home in our area. So, Jason, I'm going to, bring it over to you and just kind of let you start with what do we do, as parents, faith even aside, we'll get into that for sure, but
Absolutely.
What do we need to be looking out for? What can we do as parents?
Sure. A couple of things. I always think, to start with mental health, we're really talking about just kind of vaguely, but also specifically how you feel about yourself. So I think a lot of things we need to really focus on is how we start developing self-esteem for children. And obviously there's a lot of practical things for parents. Because obviously the big thing is communication and modeling. I think we know that on the surface, but to dig a little deeper into that and to think about what that actually looks like on a day-to-day basis, because obviously when a kid's born, it's this great, phenomenal, fantastic thing. They're going to grow up and all be doctors and famous and cure cancer. And again, not that those expectations are wrong or incorrect, but I think, one of the things we do have a huge part in mental health is that, we have to develop that. It's just like physical health. It's just like emotional health. It's just like spiritual health. We have to develop it. So one of the things I wanted to kind of talk about, especially for parents in light of recent things, is how do we really talk about self-esteem? Like, how do we develop how kids actually feel about themselves, how to relate to themselves, and most importantly, then relate to others, especially when you talk about like mass shootings and suicide. So a couple of different things I wanted to highlight. The first big thing I think when we talk about developing self-esteem and really helping kids with mental health is we really have to focus on giving them opportunities for independence. From as simple as, letting kids take their first steps, to riding the bike without training wheels. And there's many examples where as parents, it's really hard to take that step back. But one of the most important things I could encourage parents is that kids have to have some level of independence. Now, that doesn't mean it can't be supervised, but they do need to have some level of independence. And what they've found with kids is that kids, honestly, they feel better about themselves when they're able to do things for themselves. You can see a little kid, the first time he takes those steps, and we clap and we reinforce, and they have that big smile. And it's like they just conquered the world. And, when they ride the bike without the training wheels, or they bring home that paper and they got a great grade and they worked really hard. So I think, we need to do a good job of giving them just opportunities for independence. That also then kind of goes right into
Let me stop you there. Does that, how early is that? You mentioned obviously taking their first steps. Those are things we need to be mindful of.
Absolutely. Well, I think, just having children myself, I think, the first time they can hold a bottle or, to get a big burp out, I think we kind of unconsciously, but very consciously do those things as well. But I would agree. I think we have to definitely focus on, there's a lot of opportunities to provide that. Now, again, I caution it has to be developmentally appropriate. I'm not going to expect my 2-year-old to do things maybe a 12-year-old would or wouldn't do. So I think we have to really, think about stages of development as well. Go ahead.
I don't want to interrupt you on this thought process, but I just think you bring up some great points, I think, just from a parent perspective. So I have 4 kids, and one of the things that's really hard is to figure out what that line is with independence and supervision, and also stepping in and kind of knowing where those boundaries are. And I think I dance on that all the time. You're always kind of, dancing on it. My brother always laughs at me and says that my youngest is raised by the wolves because, he's the 4th child. And so he just kind of does his thing, and, oh, shoot, well, Mac, you probably shouldn't be climbing up that without me over there, so yeah.
Sure.
But again, just kind of bringing that back a little bit, just kind of knowing when it's okay and when it's not, and kind of setting those safe boundaries to some point. But I think that's a really great point.
So what are some things that maybe get in the way of that?
Oh, well,
say society today.
Absolutely. Well, I think a lot of things are convoluted. We look at a societal standpoint, like how they try to dictate new norms and what those expectations are. And parents, I think, struggle with that mightily. We were just talking about social media, and we'll talk a lot about that as it relates to anxiety and depression. But that's really the most relevant and cultural, I think, thing going on now is the access to just all these things. And I think for parents it's hard because as society is trying to develop a new normal, or human nature wants to try to acclimate to it. We want to and we've all used this argument on all of our parents. Well, Johnny's got a Nintendo, or Susie's got an Atari, or my best friend just got the new iPhone 10, So, and with parents, I think we've always had to struggle with that because it's always been the next thing or the next bigger thing. But, I think now more so than ever, society is really almost negatively dictating the terms, how parents should act, how you should treat your kid. We're using here, me and Nick were talking about bullying. Again, not to deny bullying, but a lot of these phrases start getting overstated. They're overused, and then they're actually used incorrectly. Just because somebody asked you to do something you didn't want to do, you probably weren't bullied. You know what I mean? But we got to look at those patterns. But I would agree, and I think for parents, we're traversing a landmine. I think it's more difficult than any time now because used to our parents could filter, buffer, supervise a lot more things more easily because we didn't have access to it. They could just limit access to now where kids have unlimited access. So they're pushing boundaries with parents or questioning parents on things. And we have to be really strong or sometimes feel unsure. And where is that line? Because I think that line has been blurred. I think it used to be a little bit more defined for parents. and their kids. Now, there's a lot of, even adults with how they navigate social media, there's boundaries that don't get set, and then you bring up that great point too, like where is that line where I allow my kid to do something, especially in a world that sometimes seems a little crazy and a little hectic and a little uncertain, to still have those experiences, but also knowing as a parent, trying to model and promote good habits, necessary things, where is that line? And I think one good thing about parents, I always say most parents know their kids pretty well. I mean, that is a kind of a blanket statement, but generally a true statement. You know your kids pretty well. And then I think sometimes you have to trust that parental instinct. You know what I mean? And I think especially for mothers, that maternal instinct, it's tried and true. I mean, we obviously, Mary's a great example to look at for true maternal instinct as well, because she was entrusted with the Son of Man and did a pretty dang good job, other than when she lost him at the temple, but we're digressing. But he have that opportunity, so there was something clearly at work. But
she was allowing independence.
Yeah, absolutely. Whether she liked it or not.
He was of age, right?
He knew what he was doing. But, I think it is, and it's hard because in this world, I feel like more so than ever, and I use my own kids as an example, is, where do I help them draw those lines when society says those lines can be blurred, that they can be crossed, that they can be traversed in different ways, and it gets hard. I mean, we take, like sexuality, mental health. I mean, all these are prime examples where my kid can just get bombarded with stuff, and we know some of that stuff is not true. It is not accurate. It's misleading. It can be damaging, and as a parent, my parents say, you just can't play with Johnny. It was that simple. You weren't allowed to play with Johnny. Your parents maybe never gave you a good explanation till you were much older. Whereas to now, I think, there's so many more things we have to navigate, which then in turn, we've kind of created a monster for these kids because as their brains and their bodies aren't ready to digest and interface with this information, we're just throwing it at them 100 miles an hour. So the research is very overwhelming with social media and increase in anxiety and depression. I mean, and the simple fix is, of course, we'll just get them off the devices, right? And if it was that easy, then people would be putting them down.
Right. Good luck.
But unfortunately, we're fighting that. I mean, I was just looking at some recent research, and it's amazing, the increase in anxiety and depression with kids that just use social media sites. And this was just related to true social media like Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat, Instagram, where they then try to relegate a world for themselves based off a world that's not real.
Right.
You got people from 300 miles away saying, you're ugly. You're not pretty. You talk funny. You have a ponytail. I mean, and then you take these things and it's like, it's hard enough to traverse the face-to-face real time. Life is just stressful. Life presents challenges, but then when we're adding extra challenges and layers to that, I think it's very difficult, and then when we're thinking about, when this kid grows up, I want to give him this skill set, right? And the skill set's a big, vague world of everything you think they need to survive, and that is just one overwhelming as a parent. But I think two, even more so, raising kids in this day and age. And again, I compare it to when I was growing up. I was born in the late 70s, and I remember staying out countless hours, pretty much unsupervised with, I guess, buddies. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have these things. And maybe our parents maybe were just more faithful because they had to be. Because when we left, they truly didn't know where we were or what we were doing. But I think there's also an understood thing, if they had laid a foundation, that you're expected to follow. And I still think we need to get back to that, because why it's hard to counter all the things society is telling us. The home, again, it's an integral part, I think, of all of kids' development, whether it be mental health, physical, emotional, spiritual. I mean, everything kind of starts there. And again, that one sounds overwhelming as a parent. Like, gosh, if I screw one thing up, I'm just going to damage my kid for the rest of their life. The beautiful thing is their kids are resilient, and there's also a thing called forgiveness, which I think is huge in this. But, I think the other thing too, when we're talking about like the independence, and as it, when we talk about praise and developing self-talk, there's just a lot of good things that we need to help kids do. And if nothing else, we have to counterattack what society is telling them. I use a prime example, and you're always saying, I have so many parents like, oh, my kid's the smartest kid in school. And you think that should be a compliment. That's actually a very negative way to develop their self-esteem, because it inflates their ego. It's not real. You can't be the smartest kid in school. Maybe they are, but to say that versus, did you give your best effort? But we live in a society that focuses on that instant, immediate, blow everything out of proportion. Same thing with the mass shootings. Again, obviously the research, they're on the rise. Nobody discounts that. And then of course the big thing is well, why? Why is this happening? Well, the divorce rate's at 58%. You know what I mean? You can look to that number. We just talked about this, 21% of kids that actually have an either confirmed or unconfirmed mental illness, only 21% of them actually seek treatment. There's still a taboo, even though we're in 2019, we start talking about mental health, to actually then pursue treatment or say, I have an issue. That especially if it's in the DSM-5 and it's in some book that we go, oh my gosh, then I got to call it something. And I think we had that big explosion in the 90s where we were diagnosing everything. ADHD, autism, 1 in every 5 boys has autism. I don't think that's true. But, we were kind of in that mad dash. Let's call it something. But we called it all these things. That
I think too, just to jump in quick, I think that's one of the challenges as a parent now, just kind of looking at those behaviors, say, in my own children, do you call it anxiety? I don't want to label something that's not. It can be an anxious tendency or something like that, but I think that's part of it that's kind of difficult too as a parent is, figuring that out. So I think that would be great if you could give us maybe even some guidelines to know,
Sure.
At what point, do we seek out treatment, or at what point do we just kind of continue to just encourage and, role model those good behaviors, so maybe just kind of give us some guidelines about that. That would be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the big thing, again, I encourage parents, your kids well. The big thing I say is any change in mood or behavior. And usually a good rule of thumb is it has to last for at least 2 weeks or more. Sometimes we're just having a bad day. I think those are usually telltale signs. And again, those signs could be as simple as they're sleeping more, they're sleeping less, they're more irritable. Any just changes in behavior, onset of academic problems. I think there's a laundry list of family troubles, social issues. I think the big thing there, and this really goes back to the communication, and at certain points with kids, developmentally, it can be hard to have those conversations. I have a junior high kid who usually doesn't give a lot of information. She just doesn't give a lot of information. So sometimes when you're trying to increase that communication, you think, oh, did you have a good day? Yeah, it was good. Yeah, it was fine. Which generally means it's fine, But I think that's the big thing for parents. If you just notice any just changes in behavior, and they can be really subtle, and I don't mean you got to get out your notebook and start making tick marks. But sometimes I think that can help parents, because sometimes I think right away we notice something. Whether it's maybe a little deep down, a little bit more in our gut, we kind of go, that wasn't quite typical for my kid. Now, if it's an isolated incident, I think a lot of times you can look at very natural things and look, you had a bad day, or the dog died, or whatever some of those parameters are. But, I think when you get outside of that, so I usually would look for a change in behavior or mood that really lasts for at least 2 weeks.
So let me just jump in here too. I don't have junior high kids or teenagers, but just thinking ahead, like if they aren't very talkative or don't want to share. I know that's very common to teenagers. Like, do you let that go? Is that typical? Is that common? Or again, are you just still looking for those changes, or is that something you need to address and just, is that a cue to spend more time with them?
I think is a key point. Obviously I think any time you can increase your just time with your kids in any format, I think is good. Obviously, with more concerted effort. I made a thing here. I wrote play in big capital letters. And play looks different when my kid is 2 versus my kid is 13. But it can still be as simple as, you want to play a card game, you want to go outside and, bump the volleyball around, you want to shoot some hoops in the yard. And, I think is one of the things we got to get back to too, is we're that first role model for kids. So a lot of times, as we allow them to see our own insecurities, or we're able to verbalize some of those hurts or those fears or those worries, we give them a much better capacity then to feel comfortable doing that. Again, I don't think parents ever intentionally sabotage that. You know what I mean? But I think about my own child, or being a male, if you got hurt, my parents would say, you don't cry, you're a boy. Mm-hmm. Boys don't cry. You suck it up, you rub dirt in it, and you go on. Well, that mentality isn't necessarily bad. But when that also is a culture, then you go, what do I do with that emotion when I want to express it? And I've been told that if I express it this way, it's wrong. And that's the thing too that's hard, because society now tells us we got an unlimited way to express it. And I don't know if that's always right either. But I think, look for changes in mood or behavior. Other things that are usually telltale signs is you'll see some academic issues. They usually go hand in hand if kids are school age. So look for that. Changes in sleep habits is another big one. That usually there might be some underlying stuff. Now, obviously, when we talk about teenagers, you can throw some of that out of the window because they require more sleep. Their bodies are obviously trying to acclimate to very different changes in hormones and those things. Those are usually good ones. Other things to look for, I think, are increase in social media. There's a lot of more research going that as kids become a little bit more isolated, obviously they're filling their time with those things. You know what I mean? Any other change in like a loss of activity, or loss of leisure activities when kids are like, I don't like that anymore. And again, I think the big thing, and I think, Lisa, you talked about this, that doesn't mean you got to just jump off a ledge and say, oh my gosh, my kid has an anxiety disorder or is depressed. But I do think a lot of times what happens, especially with suicide, a lot of times we're able to look back and we go, was that a sign? Now that's easy when it's the beauty of hindsight and we're dealing with a tragedy. But a lot of times I think, and this is where I tell parents to trust your intuition, because you'll see something and you're like, that wasn't right. You just know it in your heart of hearts, your gut. Those alarm bells go off and you're like, my kid did something atypical. Now, a lot of times I think there's a very normal or acceptable reason for that. The son comes home, what happened today? I got a bad grade. Okay, that's why you're crying as you got off the bus. Now, if my kid gets off the bus crying every day for 2 weeks and isn't expressing a lot of things, isn't eating, isn't sleeping, then I think you want to explore that a little more. I always say, which I don't always practice this myself, it's never too early to ask for help. And that doesn't always have to be professional help, but I think sometimes we need to reach out, family, friends, coworkers. Obviously, there's plenty of professional help. I mean, I think, and that statistic, again, where only really 20% of people actually seek help, I think is kind of alarming, because I still think
that's a good point too, because some of the things that we talk about as moms, one of the things that's really hard, again, is that social media stuff. And so, you get this idea that everybody else is doing it perfect. And, just kind of having the idea, I talk about this a little bit sometimes too, about the idea of having some humility. Like, you are not going to get it always right, always perfect. You just aren't. We're not made to be perfect. So that's one of the things. But I think the other thing too is allowing your child to know that too, which I think, you made a great point about that, and knowing failure, right? Failure's okay. And that's why you allow them to have some independence. Yeah, I really love that point. I think that's something that's so important for us as parents too. We don't have to have it all together. And even admitting that to your child, that there's plenty of times. Tonight I did that. Man, I really screwed up. I'm really sorry. And part of that, just talking through that is okay.
Right. And that's getting into the, not only the forgiveness piece, you're role modeling that. And that's something that, is not often brought up a lot of times, even forgiveness just within your own family, role modeling. And you've mentioned, before too, just the blurred lines in society of what's right and what's wrong. And, thank goodness. This is the beauty of, the Catholic Church, at least, having that authority to say, we're able to, to determine and decide, right versus wrong, and here's why. And this is why it's a good thing, because many, other denominations or, other religion, it's blurred. And again, that when you start to talk about anxiety and depression, how do you decide and what do you look to? And that's where you're kind of back to with children relying on their parents, relying on their families, having a guide point, and that's where, the authority of the church is a great thing, because, we need to have some guidelines. We need to have, a place to move about freely and not live in fear with that. And I feel like that goes hand in hand with being unsure, being, insecure as well. So just, some spiritual points on that too. And
absolutely.
So if to go back to kind of those warning signs you've talked about, sleep, changes in mood or behavior, changes in activity or loss of enjoyment in those activities, what's the next step? What should we do?
And I think that the first step as a parent, I think obviously you got to reach out to your kid, and I think that's why if you have established a good, basis of communication, it's easier to already have your foot in the door than have to tear it down, and sometimes with kids, and I think you brought up a good point as well, like where is that line when I'm hands off or take a step back versus I got to be a bull in a china shop and try to navigate that. And again, I wish I had a perfect answer. I think, I do think we have to encourage parents to fall back on their intuition. I mean, because God graced you those kids, and he also gives you a skill set to deal with those kids, even though sometimes you feel like you don't have it or it's beyond your scope. But I do think parents know their kids pretty well. But I think when you see some of those things, the first thing we just got to talk to our kids, and I think, that can be a difficult challenge. Things I struggle with too is then how do we get into like navigating their social media exposure, and are we, spying on them, or are we checking up on them? Again, as a parent, I think if you're trying to seek the truth, sometimes you got to take some drastic measures, but also understanding that, if you're doing things that violate their trust, it's going to be hard to keep that line of communication open. So I think we have to find a fine line with that, because I know parents have these apps and they can plug them in their car and they know when they're driving and how fast they're going. And while I applaud some aspects of that, we go back to that independence thing, and again, I think it is, where is that line then where I'm giving you the allowance to maybe make mistakes, to do those things, but also want to keep you safe in every sense of that word when you're out there navigating this world. And I think that's obviously a challenge as parents. But, I think, the other good thing is, and this is where the internet and some of that social media can be very helpful, is it can have some very valid points. There's a lot of social and peer groups out there when you start talking about anxiety and depression. There's support groups out there. There's countless resources. I think, and even I can even now text people if I'm struggling. Again, I don't always like that as a source of communication, but if I'm really struggling, I can reach out to somebody through a text line. There's still hotlines. There's chat lines. There's a lot more availability. The other thing I was doing a little bit of research. Kids explore that more frequently than adults think they do when they're navigating that, like reaching out, and you find out, you ask kids like, yeah, I talked to so-and-so on this hotline. So I think kids are at least aware of it. Now how well aware they are, and, you got to be mindful of, seeking professional help, because some help, might not be quite what you're looking for, especially like if you think about, holistic medicine. We were just talking about this. There's a lot of fly-by-night, new age kind of stuff that isn't really research-based. It's not scientifically, studied, and it could, you got to be mindful of that, because everybody can just say, hey, I want to help somebody, and I got a shop, and I got a hotline you can call. But I think for parents, and know your kids, reach out to your support system. I always encourage parents to do that. Call your parents. I love calling my parents saying, hey, did you ever deal with this when I was a kid, or did I do these kind of things? And again, because you have a frame of reference. Again, not that my parents by any means are mental health experts, but they knew me pretty well. So I think, rely on that, rely on your family. And then, I think when it comes to spirituality, lean on people there, lean on your priest, lean on people in your parish. But I always, I wish I was a perfect rubric, but, I think parents know when something's up with their kids. And I think that next piece is when how we're exploring that with our kids is key, because if we've done some of those things to help them foster appropriate coping skills, and we've fostered appropriate communication, it can make those lines a little easier to navigate when you're talking to your kid. And then I think you bring up a good point too, the kids seeing some of our own failures, because that's good modeling. When we say, hey man, I screwed up, I need help, I'm having trouble with this. Now again, we want to make that developmentally appropriate. Kids don't need to know all our adult issues, but I think they still can at least see the realistic part of that. I think it also in a roundabout way helps us build trust with our kids when they see us as being maybe frail in some areas or insecure in some areas, or, because they think sometimes, oh, dad and mom are just these awesome, fantastic people. And then sometimes they see that human aspect of us, and that can build some bonding things as well. I think another thing, I always put this, the big thing is seek help. Again, that research where only 20% actually seek outside help, I think is kind of alarming. Now that doesn't mean the other 80% aren't talking to their brothers and sisters and their moms and dads and maybe doing some of those things. But I always say err on the side of caution, because I think if your intuition is right, you need to pursue it. And again, I think, when you see something and you think something's not right, there's usually, that gut is usually pretty correct. I think a lot of people's intuition is very spot on. Again, that doesn't mean I think the first sign of an anxious kid or, oh, mom, I don't want to go to school. Well, okay, let's talk through that. Let's talk about some of those things. Also leaning on your kid's peer group. That still is a good source of information. Again, I say traverse that, delicately, because sometimes they're telling each other things that may or may not be accurate. But, you have to combat that too. Because I've had, even my own kids, like, well, if you've heard something on the bus, you need to tell me and your mom. You know what I mean? Just to build that. And she'll say, well, so-and-so said this. And we're like, well, that's not exactly how we would tell you or teach you or talk about it. And sometimes you need those comparisons. But I think, I would, encourage parents to seek help because it's probably as accessible as it's ever been. I mean, quite truly. I mean, it comes in so many different formats, like I said earlier, texting, call hotlines, there's chat lines, there's obviously still therapists and clinics and psychologists and psychiatrists. So I think, explore that. I think also too, for parents, trust your instinct and gut when it comes to that. Get references, look at resources, meet these people, have a session or two. Because I always tell people, like, I think I'm pretty good at my job, but I don't always click with every kid. You know what I mean? Like, just for a variety of reasons, and obviously being in the schools, we don't talk about faith and the spiritual piece as much, which I think we'll get to that here.
Yeah, I was just going to say,
I think it's huge.
I think we'll probably move into
Sure.
part 2. So that was actually a really good recap there. So high points there would be, promoting, emphasizing independence.
Mm-hmm.
It's okay to let your kids fail, allow that, so they can move on and develop their own self-esteem,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then, we went through the warning signs, of course, changes in sleep, activity, mood, behavior. It had to be longer than 2 weeks at least. And then, just the importance of reaching out, asking for help and not being ashamed of that. And opening up the lines of communication, spending quality time with your kids, same things that we need to do with our marriage, same things that we need to do, in our family. So
sure.
Just the importance, like you said, that family time and opening up the lines, and you can start, at any time. So
Okay.
I think that was the, like you said, the, glaring statistic is that, only 20% are seeking out help, for their kids. So don't be ashamed of that. Always reach out.
Right.
And, so I think we're going to wrap up here with part 1, and we'll get into more of the spirituality, faith of mental health, and continue on. So thank you, Jason.
Thank you.
Hail, Holy Queen.